Alright, here's a tool I haven't had much opportunity to break out with. It is a saw and miter box for doing small stuff like this. It's an X-Acto saw and miter box. My pop got this years ago for something and then gave it to me. Well, once he didn't need it anymore. And you know, so it's got a bit of sentimental value. Now it's not real precision work because as you can see there's some slop in the saw, so you wouldn't want to use it for doing like real precision work. There's other tools for that, but rough stuff like this, it works fine. So I'm going to cut this off, and I'm going to cut it off right here at this panel, this seam line, whatever it is. But you know, it's real simple. You just hold it and saw away, and it, you know, it's pretty quick, a little easier than some other ways of cutting, and ta-da! And it's actually not a bad cut. So the engine, I'll put that in the file, and there's the part I wanted chopped off. So real easy, very handy. If you don't have one, might be something to look into. They're not that expensive, and they can be found at like all the tools that I use. Most local hobby shops. Alright, so I need to glue this in, and when I glue it, it's going to take a while for it to cure up to a level that I can actually handle it. So do it like this. Carefully touch the inside and let it run around. Once it's set just a little, I'm going to make sure it's centered as much as possible. Sorry about my noggin getting in the way there, folks. Here, let me see if I can do it like this. Probably out of frame, but sorry, I can't really see otherwise. Oh, no, you can see it as long as my fat head's out of the way. Okay. So, I'm going to carefully knock it over. Lord. So let's try this again. Oh my goodness, I'm just determined to knock this thing around. It doesn't fit real tight and smooth. Okay, so I'm going to carefully set it aside. Success. Alright, there it is. It's going to dry up. So, while that's drying, can't really do much on that. So what I'm going to do now, like, see what is coming up next. See what else I can work on while all this is drying. Alright, so next, it looks like we got some landing gear and wheels. So I'm going to start doing a little bit of work on those. So let's get one of the wheels out here. Well, I tell you, not cooperating. Sorry, guys. Man. Alright, so there's that. And then one of the gear struts. 20 and 21. This is another one of those cases where soft plastic and really sharp cutters comes in handy. Okay, so I'm gonna cut all the parts off for this side so I don't get them mixed up and do them one at a time. So I've got 2 wheel pieces, I've got the gear strut, then we need number 24, which is this one here. And 26, which is here. That's one of those cases where you can really see a difference in, if you're familiar with modern aircraft, modern molded aircraft, newer kits, the detail on the edge is just way softer than a newer kit. And then 22. Those are big enough, so I'll go ahead and cut those off. Alright, so we have all the parts for the gear there. So obviously what we want to do first is get the little stubs of plastic from the sprue gates trimmed off as close as possible to the part. Now, actually, one thing that's kind of nice about these gear doors is there's no ejector pin marks. Now, even on modern kits, this is where you'll normally find ejector pin marks, is on the inside of the door. So that's, you know, me being the upbeat and positive guy that I am, always looking for the bright side. There is no ejector pin marks, so that's kind of nice. You're not gonna have to mess with cleaning those. So that is a positive. Okay. Getting all these large chunks of plastic trimmed off. Being very careful with these little small part. Okay. Alright, so I've got all those parts. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to, in the typical fashion, I'm going to clean them all up. On the rounded parts, like this here, I'm going to use my knife to scrape the mold line smooth. Make sure there's no burrs stuck on there, so I'll just show it in paint. And sand the edges of these, and then I'll test fit the wheels, or the tire components here, and see what we need to do to get those looking sharp. So let me start cleaning that up. Okay, here's a quick note. As you can see on this part right here, hopefully, there's a big old chunk of flash. So you gotta be really careful removing that because it's attached to a really small line, like a brake line or something, which is kind of cool because a lot of newer kits don't include brake lines and stuff like that. So it's just something to watch out for. Really delicate, so be very careful cleaning it up. But it is a nice little detail there that, you know, like I said, a lot of companies, modern companies, don't include that little detail. So I'll continue cleaning. Alright, all these little parts are cleaned up. The gear bay doors, the main landing gear strut, and this actuating piston, whatever you want to call it. So now I'm going to do the tires, the wheels. First thing I'm going to do is decide with no pins, locating pins, I'm going to sand it flush and smooth. Make sure that especially the outside edge It's nice and uniform. All right. Then on this one, I test fit it, and there's a gap. And the reason there's a gap, there's all these like little bumps inside of here. I don't know what they are. Something from the molding process. So I'm gonna make sure those are all trimmed away and gone. All right, and hopefully that should do it. So I'm going to put these two. Yeah, that took care of it. So what I want to do here is I want to have a clamp handy, and what I want to do is I want to put some cement all along the seam here, because I want it to weld together really good for cleanup later. And then before I clamp it together, I want to do like I do on any of the curved parts that I've worked on. I want to make sure that they are lined up as much as possible without any weird bumps and overhangs, and then clamp it together. Alright, so there's one wheel. So I'm going to see what this looks like here while that's drying. So you have your landing gear part here. This has two holes there and two locating pins, so that goes right there. Now, there's two ways you can approach this. You can leave it in pieces and paint everything separately, or you can paint all of it as one unit. This part goes here. Okay, two pins. Now, an interesting note here is this part overlaps. This door overlaps the bottom door. But anyway, you can do it separately, or you can do it all together and paint it as one unit. Now, I think in this case, normally I paint these parts separately, but I'm going to do this all as one unit because I'll be able to paint the parts that need to be painted with a small brush without too much difficulty. But I want to glue it because I want this to hold together really well, and I don't want to have to worry about any glue not sticking because of paint. So, and I don't want to do a lot of masking on a bunch of little tiny parts, which I have done in the past. So, one more check on the cleanup here, and then I'm going to do this part here first. Now the wheels themselves, I will be doing those separately. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Okay, and where this contacts underneath here, I'm going to put a dab of cement there as well, because like I said, I want it to really stick. Okay, so I'm going to let that cure up for a minute before I install this part. On the tire, the main thing is to get the seam off. Now, there is tread detail, and you could try and recarve that, but keep in mind, you know, the tread's going to wear down a bit from running on the runways and stuff. So I wouldn't worry too much about tread. This way I normally do on wheels. I don't know if you remember, but I demonstrated this method on armor vehicles. Just seems to be a little easier to get rid of that seam than trying to hold it and use the sanding stick or file or whatever you're using. Now, one thing that you also want to do on an aircraft model, some manufacturers model this feature in. It's also available on aftermarket offerings such as resin, wheels and tires and stuff like that. What you want to do is you need a flat spot on your tire, and the reason being is just the weight of the vehicle. It's going to smash, or the aircraft. It's going to smash the. It's going to smash down, just like a real, like a tire on a vehicle. Weight is going to push down. So just take your wheel and drag it on some decent sandpaper or a file, and just make yourself a flat spot. Okay, it doesn't have to be real heavy. And in this case, the landing gear is pretty much straight up and down. So just, hold it vertical 90 degrees to your sandpaper and make your flat spot. Okay. Some aircraft, you'll have to see what angle the wheel is in relation to the ground and, do it that way. But in this case, it's pretty much straight up and down on these wheels, so it's easy to do. So I'll clean up the other wheel, and right here is the landing gear that's already completed for the one side. The other one is currently drying, and I will place these on afterwards. And what I like to do, and I'll demonstrate it, but whenever I put these on while the cement is setting, set it down so your flat spot is perfectly on the ground where it belongs. So onto the other wheel. Since I am doing the landing gear and stuff right now, I might as well do the front. Now the front is kind of cool because it's a one-piece wheel, it's not two-piece, so it'll be easier to clean up. And you have the front strut, and the front actuator. So I will basically do the same exact thing to these that I did to the front. Again, I won't be gluing the wheel on. I will save that and paint it separately, but I will carefully remove the seam lines and sprue gate attachment points, and just get looking all decent. Alright, well, stuff is drying and I'm cleaning up landing gear stuff. I am going to go ahead and clean the rest of the landing gear doors, specifically the front. Get those cleared and cleaned up. There's an antenna, number 43. I'm going to go ahead and cut that off and clean it up. Getting near the completion of the assembly part, so I want to get this stuff all cut off and cleaned up and ready for priming. And again, nothing real exciting here. The usual stuff, clipping parts off and sanding edges smooth. So instead of subjecting you to such for entertainment. I'll work on this, come back. Alright, pretty much the last two parts that have to be cut off and cleaned up, well actually three parts, is this armored plate and headrest that goes behind the pilot's noggin in the canopy. It's canopy to you and me. That part needs to be cut off and cleaned. The rudder needs to be cut off and cleaned. And the center bay doors. And what you do here is you have to, you know, if you're doing it gear up, you would, well, you got to cut them apart irregardless, but what you have to do is you score it down the middle, you cut it right down the middle. And again, that's one of those things that I do with the back of the blade and score it instead of cut it, because it actually will remove material instead of just kind of pushing it out of the way. Just score it, score it, score it, score it, score it, score it. After you do it a few times, you can snap it apart like that. Okay, and do a little bit more here. This plastic's got some weird going on with it. Okay. All right. So, and actually, if you do it correctly, like I just did, see they go like that. So you could get it folded back and just sand them both at the same time to make it flat, because they will be gluing onto this center support right here near the end of the build. Okay. So I'll sand those down and all that kind of stuff, but the rudder, haven't cleaned it up yet, but it fits just like that. So there's a couple things you'll want to do. You want to make sure that this is nice and flat and clean. You can even, since this is a very straight, oh, you Lord, that was hard on the ears. Make sure it is nice and flat and smooth, like that. And then just make sure there's a seam right down the middle, so make sure the sprue gate attachment point is cleaned up. And then sand that molding seam line down whilst maintaining the curve of the surface, the rounded curve. And you want to make sure you don't sand too long in one spot without moving around, because you don't want to end up with weird gaps. Okay, so just do that. Same up here. Make sure that's nice and squared off, as well as this end here and that there. And then just check the outside edge and get rid of any seam line there. like I've said 1,000 times, well, maybe not 1,000, but any lines like that that you don't get rid of, if you don't find it, you'll find it in priming. And if you don't find it then, you're definitely going to find it during the weathering process, and that's not when you want to find it, because that's when things are hard to correct. Just make sure that's all smoothed down. Maintain the curvatures. All right. Okay, the engines have been installed. Everything's sanded down. A little bit of filler put in right there where I wanted it. Sanded all around the edges. So it's pretty much done around the engines. Both of them are glued into place, and both of them look good enough for our purposes. So next part is to attach the wings to the fuselage. Now what I've done is, like I said in one of the earlier segments, these kind of dipped in the middle where this seam is. So using a nice clean sander, I sanded it there and there to make them as flat and straight as possible. And the reason for that is I want it to fit as flush as possible on one edge. So like this front edge, for instance, once it's together and pushed up and lined up, it fits really flush, and we won't have to mess with any, you know, filling or anything weird like that. Okay. So that fits really well. So in the back, we have a little bit of a gap. So what I'm going to do to alleviate part of that problem is I've made this shim right here that will fit in between here, and that will take up the majority of the gap to make it easier to fill in and clean up later. So I notched it out because of my centered post, and then I cut it at a roughly curved shape, so it'll make it easier to clean this off and sand it flush. So all I have to do is just cement that in place. Mainly I want to get it tacked down first, so it won't slide around and go anywhere. And let's see, use my tweezers to kind of smash it flat there. Okay, make sure it's lined up as good as I can get it. And then apply some more cement to the whole seam there. So I want it to seal up good for sanding later. Okay, and just make sure it's seated in there really well. And that way, whenever this piece goes in position, it will fit pretty flush. Very little sanding and fitting will be necessary. So I'm going to let that cure up really well overnight, over the next couple of days. No, just overnight probably. And then that way I can move on to installing the wings. Now I've already also cleaned up the stabilizers, the rear stabilizers. Made sure those fit.